So everyone, welcome to the second session of the Theology of Religious Life module. And what we're going to be doing today is looking, having a bit of a recap on what we were doing last week, particularly with regard to the idea of biblical models of religious life. And then looking at the readings that you were given to look at for this week. And there are two questions really. First of all, do the biblical metaphors that we met last week, namely religious life as prophecy or as prophetic, and religious life as a spousal relationship, do those work? Do you think they work? Because those are very common metaphors that people use, and certainly within the tradition. Well, within the tradition, the idea of the consecrated life as a spousal relationship is very common, and particularly in any kind of description of the religious life for women. And we have a question, first of all, is it valid? Is it valid as a metaphor for religious life? And does it still work today? Because it might have been valid in another age, in another mindset. Or it might be valid for women, but not for men. Or if we look at the whole question of spousal relationships in Scripture and ask ourselves, well, what key texts are there that talk about God and a spousal relationship? Do those immediately make us think of it as a valid description of religious life as we know it? Or is there some other subtext to those spousal texts? Is there another way of looking at it that stretches our idea of how the metaphor either works or doesn't work? And in the same way, when we're looking at religious life as prophecy or as part of the prophetic proclamation of the presence of God in the world and the power of God in the world, does it work for religious life? It's very much more of a modern metaphor for religious life. It's something that religious have particularly picked up on since the Second Vatican Council and continually use of themselves. We're going to be seeing later on in some material that we'll be reading during the week for next week's class, that Sandra Schneiders, for instance, who's one of the foremost commentators on religious life, uses this idea of religious life as prophetic again and again. But we're also going to see that another commentator on religious life, the Capuchin friar Michael Crosby, actually set up a controversy with Sandra Schneiders, who was his professor at university. So he's clearly, in some of what he says, rather nervous about saying, actually, I think my teacher's wrong here. But Michael Crosby says, this doesn't work. Or at least it doesn't work the way you think it does, or the way you say it does. And Michael Crosby's argument is that religious are rather quick to appropriate to themselves and appropriate to religious life various biblical metaphors that are not unique and specific and particular to religious life. And he seems to be saying, actually, it's a bit cheeky of us to take these metaphors and think, oh, this is a great description for religious life. Because in fact, some of them are either perfectly valid descriptions of any other kind of Christian discipleship, and they're not ours to appropriate simply for our own use as religious. Or he says, actually, if you put them back into their own context, they seem to be saying some rather different things. And so the question remains, and today we are going to continue our looking at biblical texts and biblical metaphors for religious life, but we're going to then stretch that argument out into something more of a theological reflection, which is, how does the Bible and how do biblical texts help us to reflect on the nature and purpose of religious life? How does the Bible and how do biblical texts offer us a useful and truthful way of reflecting on the whole nature of religious life, and how do they offer us any kind of underpinning. And certainly it would be true that in history, many people have taken key biblical texts and from these biblical texts have gone on to recognize within themselves a vocation to religious life. I suppose one of the most obvious examples would be St. Francis of Assisi. Francis, who was trying to think about how he should best serve God and what his vocation was and how he was called. And he took the text, "Go, sell all you have, give it to the poor, and come follow me." And he saw that not just as a sort of a call to virtue or a call to discipleship that would be to any disciple, but he saw it very specifically as referring to a radical following of Christ in as total a poverty as was possible. And he and his companions saw this as being the root of a different way of living the consecrated life, a way of living religious life where you were not fixed in a monastery, where you didn't take vows of stability, where you didn't accrue wealth, but you went out on the road poor among the poor. So that would be an example of somebody actually taking a biblical text very seriously and using it as the foundation for a new way of living religious consecration. And any of you who've read Thomas Merton's Elected Silence, which I think in the American version is called The Seven-Story Mountain, there's quite a comical bit there where, if you remember, Merton had started by trying his vocation as a Franciscan friar, and it didn't work, and he left. And he was trying to discern his vocation, and he had this anxious feeling that he was being called to be a Trappist, a Cistercian of the strict observance. And this made him very anxious indeed, because he'd been told it was a silent order and he would have to be very quiet and very penitential, and this was not his notion of himself at all. But he tried all sorts of ways, including an unsuccessful foray into the Ignatian spiritual exercises on a kind of do-it-yourself basis. And his description of that is absolutely hilarious, where he talks about trying an Ignatian imaginative contemplation, and he ends up in a sort of Cecil B. DeMille scenario with a cast of thousands, people by deserts and palm trees. And in the end, Merton is so desperate to discern his vocation that he does the rather superstitious thing of taking hold of the Bible and just opening it at random, sticking his finger on the text and thinking, this will be the guidance from God. And what text did his finger fall on but, "Behold, thou shalt be silent." And that is honestly the way Thomas Merton decided to become a Trappist, according to his own account of it. So, sometimes people will take texts in that sort of a way, but maybe there are key texts which work not only as, if you like, a justification for religious life, which seems to be the way in which, to a certain extent, Sandra Schneider's is taking some biblical metaphors and texts. And that's precisely the argument that Michael Crosby is having with her and saying, you can't actually do that. But equally, for some religious, a particular text is an incredibly useful way of being able to reflect from a different angle on what it is they're about and how God and why God has called some people into this way of life, and how this life can most profitably be lived. And, you will be looking during next week also at a particular section of the course textbook, Passion for Christ, Passion for Humanity, that actually uses the Samaritan woman, but also the story of the Good Samaritan, and says, okay, let's take these two stories and reflect on religious life and see what they tell us. In a way that perhaps is a bit unusual, but gives us a new perspective on how we can make sense of religious life for today. So what I'd like to do is now hand the ball over to you and have a look at, what you yourselves made of last week's reading. Now, one of the things we did was to look at the question of the Essene way of life, and question, first of all, whether, I think one of the articles looks at the link between John the Baptist and the Essenes, but also Jesus and the Essenes, and looks at the Essene community, gives a description of it, and says, well, what kind of a life were these people living? What was the essence of their life? And how do we see Christianity linked in any way, and the emergence of Christianity linked in any way with the Essene community? And my question for that would be, well, would you see any links between what you found there and religious life as it eventually evolved? So what I'd like to suggest is that you get yourselves into two groups of three, I think basically back row and front row. And first of all, just have a little look at what you made of the bits about the Essene way of life, what you understood as the key elements of it. Did you agree with what it said as a sort of source for the movement that became Christianity? And would you see any elements there that would be common to religious life as it then emerged from within the Christian community? So a little, just chat among yourselves about that, and then we'll see if we can put something together on the board that gives us some main points. Okay, over to you. So we're looking at Boccaccini's essay on the Essenes in a book called Beyond the Essene Hypothesis, and you have a little summary of it by John McDade here, which is quite useful, and a summary of an article also by B.G. Wright, which seems to contrast what he calls Enochic Judaism, a non-conformist priestly tradition, with Zadokite Judaism, which had control of the temple cult up to the Maccabean period and was seen as a major priestly tradition. And we also kind of move from here into the notion of, into the article on the Essenes. So what did you make of all that? I mean, taking this, extracting from this any kind of reflection that might be made on the major points of religious life, some key elements of it. Did anything come up for you in the reading? Yes, says Bernadette, how lovely. I'm going to kind of keep a bit of a tally on the board, okay, and let's see what we make it. So let's ask group number one, first of all. There isn't a right answer to this, and everything else is wrong. So it's what's most important is just to hear your own views, your own responses to this.
Right, well, we kind of discussed the fact that they removed themselves from the people. Mm-hmm. removed themselves from the world in a way, and they were kind of elite. They felt they were better than other people. For purification.
And what was the purification for, as it were?
In preparation for the end of the world. And in comparing it to religious life, we felt that in earlier days of religious life, maybe there was some of these elements.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they were present. Some religious did feel that they were elite and, you know, removed from the world in many ways.
Well, you know, there was in the there was a great deal in the discourse about religious life about the pursuit of perfection.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And when we look at you know, religious life as the way of perfection or the more perfect way, it's quite difficult when you've got a lot of that sort of language not to think of religious life as in some way intrinsically a superior vocation. And what's quite interesting is that while that sort of language largely disappeared in the aftermath of the Second Vatican Council, it did actually reappear again. And has reappeared in rather more recent kind of papal documents about religious life. There's been a kind of an attempt to recover that sort of language. Yeah.
I would say that that is still the impression that a lot of lay people have too when they see religious walking around. And we were talking about that. I remember being a kid in the airport and seeing nuns, and I'd sure like to talk to them, but I don't think they'd want to talk to me.
Right.
So it's still, I think, the impression that lay people have when they see religious walking around.
And so, you know, for some people, religious being distinctive would be a sign of them somehow not only being different, but being better. Superior, and therefore that not being a kind of an invitation to come forward. Yeah. And yet, you know, for others, there would be, I have a very distinct memory of being on Waterloo Station once wearing the habit, and one of the poor men who lived on the station or around the station came to me and said, "Here you are, sister, give this to the poor." Yeah. And, you know, he had nothing. And he put 10p into my hand. But, you know, he saw me as someone who, instinctively who would look after the poor. And, you know, he was poor. And it made me feel about this high, you know. So there are different ways of looking at that. There's always kind of two sides to that coin. I just want to invite the second group to see if there's anything they want to fill in on this before we take it apart.
I guess we looked at it perhaps from a slightly higher level view. I don't know. We looked at the difference between the Essenes who remained in the city and lived out a kind of a ritual form of life within the confines of the city, compared it to the Qumran, the Qumran community who removed themselves and and kind of very troublingly, I think, in a couple of mentions there, there are archaeological remains of families around the edge of the community which were very much kept away from the centre. I don't know. It was and maybe thinking about more widely in religious life, you can see those two models which came out very strongly in the reading. You have a model perhaps which bases itself on social action, and then one which is more contemplative, I suppose, in those two communities.
And therefore, in many ways, there are elements of something that emerged as a phenomenon within the Christian community itself already there. one of which is about, living, how would you describe it? Perhaps a very focused life, a life that had God and the commitment to the things of God at its centre, but living it among ordinary people, and one which had the same focus and the same commitment, but saw it as necessary to support that life, to separate itself away from worldly concerns. Before we look at that, I'd just like to look at the things you yourselves noted here. Particularly the one about concern for purification, or concern, if you like, to live a life that was not trammelled by worldly concerns of kind of money and business, but also of possessions. If we look at religious life, at the common elements of religious life, however the vows are actually taken and whatever vows are taken, there are elements of a commitment to a radical form of simplicity, a radical form of single-heartedness, which is embodied in a chaste or celibate life, and a radical form of obedience, primarily to the call of God and the law of God, and then to the community itself. And if we look at religious life, particularly religious life for women, as it was historically lived, many of the restrictions on the life that women led in religious communities were concerned with preserving this kind of radical call. I imagine a couple of us in this room at least will have lived some sort of voluntary restriction of movement, even in the apostolic congregations. Some voluntary in the sense that we signed up to it, whatever we might have felt about it, some voluntary restriction of access to our families. Now, that can take, extreme forms. Certainly, I have a friend who was a religious who was permitted to go to her mother's funeral, which was already a very special permission. She was not an enclosed religious, but she was not allowed to go into her family home and have a cup of tea afterwards with her father and her siblings. And that was seen as somehow preserving the form of enclosure that this order had, although it would be seen now technically as a fully unenclosed and apostolic order. This was some 40, 50 years ago, where rules were very different. I don't know, the three of you who belong to effectively apostolic congregations, although I think Maureen's, yours has probably been more of a mixed congregation, hasn't it, historically? But would that have been your own experience of when you first entered the order of kind of restrictions on going out?
Absolutely.
For you, would that have been quite
It would have been quite strong.
Yes.
I can remember our novice mistress suggesting to us that if the priest were not able to come down from the parish to say Mass on a Sunday, it was better for us not to go to Mass on Sunday than to go to the parish.
Right.
And as novices, we sat and rebelled and said, no, we didn't think that was true. That we didn't believe that, and we wouldn't do it.
What a very bold novice you were.
How we survived in the congregation at that moment.
Yes.
Yeah. But it was as strong as it
yes.
was as strong as
yes.
that.
Yeah. And Agnes, what about you?
For me, not really, but I had an aunt in my order. And she was allowed to come home. Unlike a lot of others, I had a first cousin in a different order, and she could only do what you were saying.
Yes.
She could come to our house, but she couldn't go to our own house.
Yes.
Which was crazy. And they always had to have a companion.
Right.
So that was quite different.
So there was quite, there would have been quite an element of confusion sometimes about what this was for, what it was about. Bernadette, did you experience something similar?
Well, no, just that there was a time frame, like you weren't allowed to go home.
Right.
Like you had no permission to go home. Like when I entered, it was probably maybe 6 years before we were allowed to go home. But
yes. And what would have been the reasons given for that? Given that none of you had entered enclosed orders where clearly that was part of the kind of essence of the order itself.
Well, like you said, I don't think there was ever any reason given, because this was the vocation that I felt I was called to, so I would have signed up to anything they told me I had to do.
Yeah, sure.
And you didn't ever question it, really. Yeah. I think it's only as you mature in religious life that you maybe start to question things as to why they were.
Yeah. And presumably for all the congregations that would have had these kinds of rulings, it was something about, people not getting too confused between a world that they had left and a life that they had left, and the kind of worldly considerations. And certainly if you read back into concerns about religious life, for instance, I did a great deal of research into the reform of religious life in France in the 17th century. And one of the most consistent complaints was, for instance, of and this would have been, of course, in enclosed monasteries, because that's all there was at the time I was researching. Sisters setting up a sort of financial differentiation between one sister and another. So you'd have one sister who came from a home where people could come and visit, family members could come and visit and bring lots of rich presents and rich food and things. And then another sister wouldn't have that kind of a background. And so you ended up with a very economically tiered system of life within the monastery. And the perception that this was something that really militated against community life, or that people would end up, and you get this also in writings about sisters in convents in Venice in the 16th century, for instance, sisters being given rather smart worldly clothes to wear in addition to their habits, and, throwing wild parties in the parlour, while the rest of them were sitting there gnawing on a fishbone, out in the refectory. Yes?
I know that the missionaries of charity today, they still, they're still quite strict in that respect.
Yeah.
And I know that you, for example, they won't have tea with someone. They'll only have it. I asked them why. I was with them for a bit, and they not as I don't like this thing, not as a sister, but I was with them, and they said that the reason was because they wanted to do everything together as a community. So if one went off and had a meal with someone who's not in the congregation, then they're breaking up their community.
And so there's a sort of tension that's to do with keeping a very single focus and living a life that is congruous with the vows you've made, and with a sense of radical equality. Now, there are plenty of arguments against that, and saying, well, actually, Jesus himself went into people's homes and dined with them, and there were those who complained about it, but he felt that he was, calling them, and part of his invitation to them to give their lives to God and to turn to God was to go into their space. So, there are, it seems to me, perfectly valid arguments for and against this. But if we look back at this Essene community, clearly there is something in the roots of what is thought of as a radical commitment to the Gospels, a radical calling to follow Christ. that is not saying, family life is bad or the world is necessarily entirely evil and we must flee it, but that these are the last days. We're living in apocalyptic times. And therefore, rather like St. Paul, where he says, people of course can marry, but given that there was a period in the New Testament where Paul clearly also believed that the world was coming to an end, Paul said, I would suggest that you don't get involved in all of this, because life, time is very short and the judgment is coming. So there's a sort of apocalyptic element to this. And the apocalyptic element, I wonder if we look at religious life today, where might we see in it any kind of apocalyptic consciousness, or might we see within religious life today any sort of apocalyptic consciousness that sees religious life as some kind of eschatological sign, something that points to the last days and points to the coming of Christ? It's quite a big question to ask you. But in the discourse about religious life, in the way that religious describe themselves, in the choices that they make, would you see there being any kind of link now between that and this apocalyptic element?
I think I see it in the vow of celibacy or chastity, because I think it's one of, if you like, the justifications is that really time is foreshortened, so that living for God alone, there just isn't time for other relationships. So one cuts them out in a radical kind of way.
And that would be one argument. I mean, there are many arguments for celibacy, and there would be other people who'd say, well, gosh, it's not just about shortage of time, it's about a condition of the heart, if you like. But there would be that sort of a notion. Any other notions about religious life as eschatological sign?
I think maybe not in the vows per se, but in the sort of choosing to live by a different set of values from the world. So maybe things like not looking for affirmation or a sense of success through your career, or not getting caught up with the sort of speediness of communications in the world. Some of those other signs that aren't part of the vows that we try to live out is about saying we've got our eyes set on a society and a culture which does things differently.
Right.
So eschatological in that sense.
And it's therefore, we have our eyes on the kingdom, and we see ourselves as living primarily in and for the kingdom. And I think a lot of the kingdom language, or as we might now more inclusively call it, the reign of God language, would be about religious life having a symbolic significance of proclaiming to the world the reign of God. And of course also, in recent decades, many religious have taken up a very strong discourse of justice, which is actually, which has an eschatological flavour, because it's talking about, so much of what current culture sees as important is passing, is pointless, and there is, the things of real matter are being subordinated to that. So it's saying we want to live, we want to walk to a different rhythm, we want to march to the sound of a different drum. But also, increasingly in recent years, religious have taken a very firm stance about the future of the planet, and therefore the future of humanity, and the future of created reality as we know it. and through the living of the vows and through their living in community, are also trying to talk about a concern that we are bringing about the end of the world through living in a consumer culture, through living in such obvious overconsumption from one end of the world and such agonizing underconsumption in the two-thirds world, which is suffering monstrous levels of poverty. So in that respect, there is a sense in which religious life does stand as a judgment.
Does that bring it to being prophetic? Because when you're using this language and saying it's apocalyptic, I mean, I would certainly think of apocalyptic. I would think of, if you like, of nuclear disasters and things like that. That would be apocalyptic in my imagination. But when you're talking about justice and concern for the poor, I can see the way your argument is going. But my first thought would be, but then what we're trying to witness to is a different way of doing things, which is therefore prophetic, but it's witnessing to a different set of values.
Yes. I suppose in using the word apocalyptic, I'm thinking principally in terms of eschatology. I'm thinking principally in terms of the way Jesus would say, you know, the kingdom of God is upon you, the kingdom of God is here. And in a sense, as it says in one text, in my Father's house I am but a passing guest. You know? And whether or not there was an element in the Essene way of life that then gets translated into the early desert fathers and mothers, who in many ways reproduce some of the elements of the Essene way of life. The withdrawal, the searching for a greater perfection, the rejection of living for money and power, the rejection of exclusive relationships for the sake of God, for the sake of the kingdom. And in that respect, they are living from an eschatological perspective because they have their eyes fixed on the things of heaven. They have their eyes fixed on the kingdom of God rather than the kingdom of this world. And of course, the fascinating thing, which takes back, Jamie's point, the fascinating thing that emerges from that whole desert movement is that there comes to be, if you like, another strand of religious life. And I think the writings of St. Augustine had a great deal to do with this, that looked at, the city of God and the city of this world, and actually drew people not to complete withdrawal, but to the living of a life of particular focus on God within society. And you therefore get the two elements of religious life, the one which separates itself from society and sees that separation as an essential part of its very nature, and the one that sees itself separate from the dominant values within society, but doesn't see itself as physically and technically separate from society, and actually sees itself as going back into society and both modelling and proclaiming a different set of values. So it seems to me that this Essene link is, at least the life of the Essenes is quite a useful way of reflecting on, how did religious life emerge? What were the elements within it that could be seen as part of a kind of radical following of God that has its roots before Christ himself and before the emergence of the Christian communities, but that does therefore bear these, for want of a better word, prophetic stroke eschatological elements. And if we look at, very briefly, the whole question of, removal from the world, elitism, and that sense of being perhaps better than others, of course, the irony is we see a great deal of that sort of polemic between Jesus himself and his followers and those who were trying to live a more separate and removed life, namely in the New Testament, the whole polemic between Jesus and the Pharisees. And what's interesting is that Jesus keeps holding the line, or appears to keep holding the line, that removal, withdrawal, separation isn't going to be what makes you righteous. And that actually turning to the poor, service of the poor, service of the outcast is more reliable as a source of righteous living. Bless you. Is more reliable as a source of righteous living. Yes.
However.
Oh, let's have a good however. Yes.
Jesus takes himself up the mountain.
Yes.
And into the desert and gets up early in the morning to pray.
Yes.
And it would seem to me that he, whereas he certainly doesn't cut himself off from people, he does build in an element which is separation.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I would want to say it's something about union with God and contemplation that requires that requires its own space, if you like, in which to be operational.
Right.
So that it's necessary to
so
and that Jesus is doing that.
Uh-huh.
That
Jesus is doing it, and indeed inviting his disciples. Come away with me to a quiet place to pray. Of course, when they get there, the crowds have followed them. Haven't we all been there? We decide to find ourselves a nice little quiet corner, and then we find everybody's there. But doesn't this also warn us that we need to be careful when we're using biblical images and metaphors? Because you can say yes but to so many of them, and perhaps we shouldn't be too quick to try and read into Scripture a kind of justification for exclusively one or other type of religious life, or indeed religious life itself. Because there is, quite clearly, Jesus didn't found a religious order. Jesus didn't start a monastery. There's the bottom line there. There may, however, be elements both of Jesus' own story and his own practice and his own preaching, or elements within the wider Bible that give us a good source for reflecting upon how religious life emerged, what its nature is, and what it is that actually helps to support and resource it. Oh, Joe, let's have... Yes, of course.
Can I make 2 points? Can I?
Yes, you can.
The separation thing.
Yes.
I suppose my concern with the Essenes, and this might just be my ignorance about their literature, is that what I don't see in their separation is that solidarity with the world, that a key teaching of the contemplative life would be that you go apart, but that in going apart you enable yourself to be united and in solidarity with the world in a much more profound way than is possible if you're in the thick of it, just living in your own particular corner of it. That's my first point.
Can I take that? Because I think that's an enormously important point. Because actually, if some of us lived, and if some religious orders lived at a point, a sort of separation, because it was seen to be dangerous to get too close to worldly ways, if that was, because that did seem to be sort of part of the rhetoric that went about religious life in the past. And I just want to put a little bracket in there and a parenthesis in there. I don't know if any of you ever read the story. It comes into the famous commentaries on religious life by Rodriguez, but it came from the stories of the Desert Fathers, of a monk who went away on a journey somewhere, and because he was on a journey, he was given money to go on his journey. And when he came back to the monastery, he didn't give the money back as his rule told him to. He kept it in his cell, and unfortunately for him, he died during the night. And he was found to have this money. And his brethren, who were shocked and appalled by this infringement of the rule, I think, if I remember, either walked over him on their way into the church or sort of trod on him, and buried him in a dung heap, buried him in the midden, and were encouraged to say, "To hell with you and your damned money," you know. Now, we were told a sort of a shortened version of this story, so that whenever I, as a novice, if ever a random coin was found, you know, among one's possessions, or in the car, you know, a coin had dropped down the floor of the car and you picked it up, you know, everyone around you would chant, "Oh, buried on a dung heap." Or if you found a coin in your pocket, "Oh, I'm going to be buried on a dung heap." So, you know, that idea of sort of separation from all that is dangerous seems to me completely opposed to what Joe is saying is an understanding today among the contemplatives who do live quite a marked degree of separation from the world. That paradoxically goes with a profound sense of solidarity with the world, and that actually withdrawing from a world in which, in a sense, many nuclear families live alongside each other, but quite separated from one another in their own little enclaves, in their own little homes. One of the ways that the contemplative orders would see themselves as living is separated from that world, and yet precisely because separated from it, deeply united with it. It's a very different kind of theology, a very different kind of rhetoric, isn't it? Those of us who are living the consecrated life not in a monastic setting, would you see that as part of your own idea of religious life?
Yes, to an extent.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
We would. And especially, I think, specifically for the congregation that I belong to, because our work is very much within our own house. Like, we wouldn't be going outside. Mostly our work is within the house that the nursing homes are attached to the convent, so we're very much within the same setting, as opposed to maybe going out to nurse in a hospital.
Right,
you know?
right.
So there is that kind of and the inclusiveness in our prayer life.
Right.
Of the people that we work with.
Right.
You know, like reinforces the fact that while we are removed from them in one sense, in another sense we're very much with them at all times. You know,
and it would be, I think, part of a certain explanation of, or justification of, the vow of celibate chastity. That choosing not to be part of an exclusive relationship, like the relationship of marriage, which excludes other sexual relationships, actually calls you into an inclusive relationship with everybody, with the whole world, particularly perhaps with those you serve in a direct way, but very much a life given over to prayer for the world and service of whoever God sends us to. I think that's a good moment for us to take a break, a much needed break. And when we come back after the break, I'd like us to look at, what's in the other readings, and then just take a step back and see if we can get an overview of the kind of scriptural bases. Okay. So I'd like to ask Jo, if she could just bring us up to date with her second point that we've all been waiting for with bated breath.
I'm hoping actually you'll be able to use it as a lead into where you want to go next.
Excellent, I'm sure I will.
It's when you said that Jesus didn't actually found a religious order or a monastery himself, I was really struck when I was doing the reading on prophecy, that for me an obvious biblical metaphor for religious life is the Jerusalem community and that sort of situation in the first few chapters of Acts. So that there was something in Jesus' preaching and praxis that meant very early on the Christians felt the need to form themselves into some kind of community, giving a witness and common possessions and unity in prayer and the things that we would say might be distinctive of religious life. There was something that even if he didn't say this is how to do it, or we don't have him recorded saying that, there was something about the impression he made that people felt that was a logical conclusion or a logical way of living out his teaching after he'd gone. And I'm really intrigued why that doesn't pop up as a metaphor for religious life more frequently. And am I missing something?
No, I think it's a very good point. I suppose if I was wearing Michael Crosby's hat, and when you've read his article, you'll I think take this on board. I suspect he would say, yes, but that's given as an ideal for the whole church. And therefore this brings us into a question of the relationship between religious life and the church as a whole. And if you like, the ecclesial role, or the role within the ecclesia of religious life. And again, it's a dangerous thing to take scripture and make it dance to one's own tune. But we know that, for instance, that little section very early on in Acts where it talks about the Christian community, how, they were of one mind and one heart, and they all went up to the temple to pray together, and so they were a community of prayer, and they shared everything that they had, and they sold what they had to the poor. We know that this is a highly idealized view of the church. Excuse me, because later on, we have them quarrelling with each other. We have the leadership quarrelling among itself. We have the terrible, dramatic story of Ananias and Sapphira holding back some of what they possess and pretending they've sold everything to the poor, and then both of them falling down dead at the feet of Peter and all of this. And so we know that already, even at the very beginning, there is both the presentation of the ideal and the presentation of a much more ambiguous reality. And of course, that would also stand for the history of religious life, which is always a history of, a time, and people have given us a sort of timetable, as it were, of the charismatic leader and the growth of the charism and the time of ideals and of many people flocking and lots of followers, and then the second generation which consolidates it all into some sort of a rule, and the third generation which consolidates it all into a way of living that becomes less charismatic and more regulated, and then an inevitable decline until there is some kind of a reform. And there's a sort of a rise and fall in the rhythm of religious life. And I think we could see that there's a very similar pattern in the church itself. And we can point to moments in history where the way that things have been in the wider community of the church have been an absolute disaster. And then suddenly someone comes along, and interestingly enough, it's often a religious or someone attached to a religious order, like Catherine of Siena, like Hildegard of Bingen, like Francis of Assisi, like Dominic, who become the seedbed of a much wider movement of reform and purification. So why isn't it used as a metaphor of religious life? I suppose because many of the metaphors we seek are trying to show that there is something specific and particular to religious life. And so we go for these very strong images of prophecies, say, things that show how distinctive and different it is. And of course, we know we're not on strong ground taking that particular bit of scripture because it so clearly refers to the whole emergent community. Maureen, yeah.
Well, there are two things that are striking me from what you're saying. And the first is, there's another image which I think I resonate with as religious, and that's the covenant one. But equally, I think that covenantal relationship of God with his people, it becomes a very good image of the church, as well as being a good image. I think it is a good image of religious life, especially as religious life as it desires union with God, and is going for that. And so and we haven't mentioned covenant, I think, thus far.
We're about to.
Yes, spoiled your line. Yes. But I was thinking, well, maybe there is something about religious life which is precisely that, the way it reflects something about the church as a whole that's important, and that we ought to be saying, articulating, in what's this relationship of religious life to the church. In that sense.
I think you're absolutely right, and it's marvellous that you've kind of fed in directly to something I would want to say, which is that, and we will be looking at this later on, that if that is true, and if we take the covenant relationship, as we mentioned last week, as a kind of extension of the spousal relationship, because after all, when we looked at some of those spousal metaphors in the Bible, particularly when we looked, for instance, at the spousal references in the book of Hosea, for instance, about God luring the beloved out into the desert, and there are many references of, and I will be your husband, but also you will be my people and I will be your God. So much of the spousal reference is also embedded in covenant references. And of course, Ecclesiology has taken up those references and looks at the church, indeed, as does do the Greek scriptures, the church as the bride of Christ, and the whole community as the bride of Christ. Then perhaps one of the ways we can look at religious life is somehow embodying, symbolizing, enacting that particular aspect of covenant in individual people. That individuals enact the covenant, the spousal covenant, through the vow of consecrated chastity. And it seems to me, actually, that is a very helpful use of spousal imagery and spousal metaphors, which quite a lot of modern religious and Catholics kind of slightly squirm at, because they find the idea of being the bride of Christ all a bit kind of flowery or a bit wide-eyed, and actually it isn't about Sister Twinkletoes being the kind of ingénue, playing an ingénue role and being the bride of Christ in a way that is seemed to be naive, I think. And I think some modern people would see it in that way, though I think they'd be wrong to do so. But I think that's one of the reasons it's not been a more popular metaphor. It hasn't survived as a very popular metaphor. And of course also because there are whole kind of gender dynamics in that metaphor that if people have strong questions about the way gender dynamics have worked in the church, it would also make them worried, Bernadette, let's give you the microphone and see.
I went to see the film
of
Men of God, and in actual fact that came out very profoundly when they were discerning whether the monks, whether they would stay or whether they would go, and one of them brought out, he said, I love you, and it came out very, very strongly.
And wasn't it beautiful?
There is so much in it. You could talk forever
Absolutely.
about it. But that actually came through, didn't it? Very gently. Very,
wasn't it?
very
And
powerful.
it was a male religious, talking to God. And it didn't feel remotely strange.
I was thinking about what we said
So was
last
I,
week.
Uh-huh.
About,
I couldn't help you.
I definitely when we were talking about there being more to this spousal language than just a
kind of hearts and flowers. Yeah.
Not just the erotic part. I mean, it's really powerful.
It came out very strongly, as he was discerning.
It's got shivers.
So, this is, a modern French film of gods and men.
It was in the crucible of him in this really risky, what does his life mean and what is he going to give it to?
Yeah.
And that was where this belonging to Christ was so much more than, it was so rich and deep.
And also, if you look at it, he was the monk in the film who was struggling with his own fear of death and his sense of the pointlessness of the sacrifice. And there's a marvellous moment, if you remember. I'm sorry for those of you who've not seen the film, I'm spoiling the moment for you, but anyway, do go and see it. Where he's talking with the prior, who was the one who made the decision to stay at the very beginning of the film. And he says, what are we dying for? Why are we staying here to die? It seems completely mad. Yeah. And the prior says, yes, almost as mad as becoming a monk in the first place. And, it's a kind of tender moment between the two of them, but it's also one in which you see a man struggling with radical self-giving, radical self-sacrifice, and coming not only to the choice and facing the terrible, terrible dark night of the soul, and it really is a very dark night where he's unable to pray, and he prays and prays and calls out for God's help, and God is silent. And all he can hear are his terrors and his fears. And when eventually he comes to a place where he can choose to stay in solidarity with his vow, after all his vow of stability, and with his community, that is also the moment where that deep, deep spousal love floods into his soul. And there is great peace, isn't there? And therefore, thank you for bringing this up, because I think it is the DVD's coming out soon, DJ, and I'm sure your community will hugely enjoy it. I hope so.
In the States yet. Is the DVD going to come out soon?
February.
It's not being released in the States till February 25th.
Aha. Well, I'm
on
told.
Theaters.
I believe that the film is coming out in February. And certainly one of the teachers on this course is intending to use bits of it in her class. Yeah. But if we go back to, therefore, the spousal relationship there being one of commitment, but being also one of total self-giving, I will be your God, you will be my people. And so I don't want to say, the whole kind of erotic love imagery and metaphor is pointless, because it isn't, and some extraordinary theology and poetry has emerged, whether from Bernard of Clairvaux or of John of the Cross, or of other writers who've used that kind of imagery for the relationship between the soul and God. Nevertheless, it seems to me that the spousal relationship, if we see it as a covenant relationship, actually does give a strong spiritual and theological underpinning to the whole life of the vows, and the whole vowed life, and the sense of the total giving of oneself, body and soul, to the other, in the way that, you know, marriage is a total giving of oneself, body and soul, to a single-hearted and single-minded love of the other. So it works. In the very short time that we have, because unfortunately this is what happens, we get into these wonderful discussions, and but let's just have a look at the rest of the reading that you had. Some of it was just simply raising the question, well, how do we use the Bible effectively as a way of reading religious life? I wondered if there was anything in what you read that raised a question for you, or that struck you as particularly either good and significant or problematic. Yes, Maureen.
I have to say that I felt that is it Mary Mills who wrote
Yes.
about the images of God as Father and so on from a feminist perspective? I was riled by it. I found it old-fashioned, dated, and I thought she sets herself up, it seems to me, to speak for women, and I don't think she does actually. And I must say the question for me was, why is this here for us to read in this particular context?
Any sense of why it was there, or
It was another perspective.
it's another perspective. It's
sure,
another perspective, and I suppose, you know, one has to look at the way in which the Bible and biblical imagery has been used to describe and define the relationship of women with God and women with themselves, as it were, which many women have found problematic. And
where she was coming from. I'm quite happy with the imagery of God as husband.
Yeah.
But I could totally see why she wasn't. It made sense what she was saying. And I appreciated her raising the question.
And I suppose in that respect, it's important for us to raise the question, even if only to find our answer to it, and our answer to say, well, actually, I've read this, and it doesn't work. But if there are scriptural imagery, bits of scriptural imagery that have been used to reinforce a subordinate role within the church and within society for women, then, you know, many women outside religious life, but also many women inside religious life, have found that an unsatisfactory way to describe them, and an unhelpful way to think about their reflection, to reflect upon their relationship with God. And it also brings up questions about the way in which religious in general, female religious and women, have been treated within the church. And
Still being treated.
and are still being treated in some parts of the church. It is, you know, we cannot run away from the fact that this is problematic. And of course, it becomes more problematic, I think, precisely because of your first point, which is that, you know, you find the whole idea of covenant relationship powerful and helpful and effective. And I would say that if that is true, and I would certainly find it true for myself, it also carries a problem. And the problem is that spousal imagery, when it is covenant imagery, will always bring us back to the fact that the religious life is an ecclesial relationship. It's a relationship within the church. And after all, it does actually commit religious to taking a public stand and making public profession of vows within the church that are validated by the church. The problem with that is that, I mean, I have no problem with that in general. Obviously, otherwise I wouldn't be a religious myself. But if religious, and it would be the case that many female religious, have found themselves in conflict with the church over the way in which the church has viewed and treated women through history, then you end up making public profession of an ecclesial way of life in a church with which you are at odds. And so this is one of the reasons given in the developed world for the fall-off in vocations. That may or may not be true, but it certainly raises issues that we are going to be looking at when we look at, the religious life as part of the ecclesial community. I want to stop there because I think that's a good place to leave us. I would just say, though, that with regard to the religious life as part of the ecclesial community, it equally is a challenge to people who see the religious life or who appear to live the religious life as some kind of alternative church, because actually it can't be. The religious life cannot be an alternative, cannot be a kind of rival church within a church. For good or ill, our spousal relationship, our covenant relationship with God is actually one that binds us into the church and actually makes us and our way of life symbolic of the church. It is validated by the church, but it actually acts as a symbol for the church. We cannot get away from that. We therefore have to find new ways, fruitful ways, of being able to live the tensions that lie within that. Okay, thanks very much, everybody.
Thank you.